im se svima, i malima i velikima, i bogatima i siromašnima, i slobodnjacima i robovima, dade žig na njihovu desnu ruku ili na čela njihova, te da nitko ne može ništa kupiti ili prodati, osim onoga ko ima žig ili ime zvijeri ili broj imena njezina.
Pozdrav, dragi narode, dobrodošli u još jednu epizodu Slobodni. Današnja tema je politika Donald J. Trumpa. Naime, svi smo svjesni toga da u javnim analizama imamo dva tabora. Jedan koji ga mrzi i jedan koji ga obožava. Ja sam promatrajući to shvatio da niti jedan niti drugi ne uspijevaju objasniti niti jednu od svojih stajališta. Naime, većinom stvari se svode na emociju i na predrasude koji su stvoreni odmah u startu. I onda se i analize rade s te pozicije. Stoga sam istražio i pronašao one koji se dugi niz godina bave globalnim politikama, geopolitikom, financijama na geoekonomskom području i odlučio sam da analiziram upravo s nekim koji može objasniti zašto je nešto dobro, a zašto nije. Stoga danas nam je čast predstaviti vam gošću koja se naziva gospođa Susan Kokinda. Hello, Mrs. Kokinda, welcome to our show in Croatia.
Thank you so much for having me.
Can you say a few words about your background for our audience?
I'll just say that I've been politically active for about a half a century, going back to the assassination of Bobby Kennedy Sr. when I was campaigning for him in California. And like many in my generation, we realized there was something more beneath the surface in terms of what was driving politics. And for 50 years, I've been involved in organizations which tried to get below the surface of what was going on, which is why I think we've been uniquely positioned to understand the real nature of the fight that shapes the Trump administration and his enemies.
And that's where we're going to go today. But today, when we are recording this, it's a special day because today just started war between USA, Iran, and Israel. Well, we cannot forecast what will happen the next 7 days while we're going to record and went in the air. But can you tell us what is the background of this conflict for years?
Well, I think, and I'm glad we're not going to forecast. It would be very foolish without intelligence in terms of what drove the president to finally make this decision, all the other players in the region, and so on. But I think the only way to understand it is to go back over 100 years to the Sykes-Picot Treaty. The Mideast has been a cockpit for war by imperial forces deliberately, in particular the British, who have constantly ensured that you don't have peace in the region, so that they and others among what we today call the globalists can continue to extract the oil, can continue to control this strategic crossroads in the world. So without going into a lot of historical detail, what you're seeing is ultimately the outcome of what are called British geopolitics, where every nation is a piece on a chessboard, and it's simply played for the larger imperial picture. What the president has made very clear is he is not a geopolitician. He is not, whatever is unfolding right now is not on the geopolitical chessboard. Whether or not there were provocations being run, by various of British assets in the region, whether it's in Iran, in Israel, or elsewhere, I'm not obviously in any kind of position to say, but I think we can look at what the president did earlier with Midnight Hammer and what he did in Venezuela. These are not traditional regime change operations which lead to permanent chaos. He's got a mission. This one obviously is going to be a little bit more difficult, put it mildly, but I think his mission is what he said, which is to defend the people of the United States.
And okay, now let's go step by step according to his politics. What was consequences of this action in Venezuela?
Well, if you look at the consequence, it's very, very interesting. A lot of people who don't like Donald Trump immediately screamed regime change, regime change, regime change. That was not the case. If he had wanted regime change, he would have gone to the Nobel Peace Prize winner, whom all the regime changers wanted to put in, And when he was asked, why didn't you do that? He says, do you remember a place called Iraq, where we removed the existing government and we ended up with complete chaos? So he's working with the legally, designated president, Delcy Rodriguez, made clear in his State of the Union he's got a good relationship with her. They are working with Venezuela to resume oil production for the benefit of Venezuela and obviously our mutual benefit. So again, for all those who either wanted a classic geopolitical regime change or were upset that it was a geopolitical regime change, that is not what you've seen. Venezuela is stable at this moment. Prisoners are being released. The oil fields are being reopened. And I'm sure a large amount of the narcotics and other terrorist activities which were emanating from Venezuela have been choked off at this point.
You're also covering the crisis in 2008, huge crisis. And you were analyzing what was happening at that time. And as I understood well, there was an important role of these cartels who was trading with drugs in this financial crisis. Can you explain us this?
Well, you actually have to go back a little bit further. You have to go back to the British policy of creating the entire offshore banking operation in the Caribbean, where suddenly you have the ability to accumulate huge pools of money outside the control of governments that could be used for terrorism, that could be used for drug money laundering, that could be used for all sorts of nefarious kinds of activities. And that's the kind of quintessential aspect of an imperial system, where you want to have supranational or extranational institutions that are above nations and that can be used to attack nations, because the centerpiece of an imperial policy is they don't like national sovereignty. They don't like any sovereign nations, whatever their political complexion may be. And so whether it's terrorism, whether it's these offshore money laundering kinds of operations, psychological warfare being carried out by international institutions, the imposition, again, of supranational policies like free trade or green climate policies above nations. That's the characteristic of empire.
How was this global world order built from 1945?
Well, I think you have to go back a little bit earlier. You have to go back to the origin of the British Empire. And again, if you look at the characteristics of the British Empire, which we Americans know very much because we fought an American Revolution against them, there are institutions like the Bank of England, a private central bank which controls how the currency and credit of a country is deployed. Not the government, but a private central bank, or the British East India Company, which trafficked in slaves, in drugs, and so on. Those are the institutions of empire that we fought against. And what the American Republic created was really the first sovereign nation which had a sovereign economy. In other words, the economy was created under Alexander Hamilton to protect the nation, protect the producers, protect the people from these international financiers. And throughout, the last 200 years, what you've seen is the British Empire trying to reestablish this private financier operation. They made big strides in 1913 when we surrendered and created the Federal Reserve. And then you referenced the post-war period. The breaking point then was 1971, when the dollar was under British attack. Richard Nixon took the dollar off the gold reserve standard. And essentially, that was the first step in the United States really completely surrendering its economic sovereignty to this globalist financier elite. And it's been downhill since then until Donald Trump came along.
What has changed after 2008, or everything has stayed the same?
Well, I would say that it was like the cancer metastasizing. Because what we saw in 2008 was the natural collapse of a system which was based on pure speculation, and speculation which was constantly undermining the productive capacities of a nation. I often compare it to a gigantic parasite on top of a little dog. That's your financial system. The little dog is your people, your productive capacity. And you reach a point where it collapses. Now, what should have happened in 2008 is we should have said, oh, well, that doesn't work. We've got to cut back on the speculators. And there was a fight in Congress in 2009, 2010 to go back to a more sane form of financial regulation so these speculators could not get out of control. We lost that fight, and the speculative bubble has gotten bigger and bigger and bigger. I will say that the new Treasury Secretary and the proposed Federal Reserve Chairman have been very clear on record they want to reverse that.
Yes, and also you investigated that they used this offshore money, exactly money from trade of drugs, to sanate lots of banks and financial system in Wall Street.
Yes, absolutely. In fact, there's a very important speech. I can't remember the year right now, sometime in the last decade. The Russian drug czar gave a speech at the United Nations. I can't remember his name off the top of my head, but he was very clear. He said, if it were not for these illegal drug money flows, the major banking institutions would have collapsed after 2008. So they rely on this. This is their system.
That means we saved exactly our world economy was saved by the drug money.
Well, I wish it was the economy, but it was the world banking system that was saved by the drug money. The actual economy of our nation and other nations continued to suffer, and until now, when you actually have a challenge to this kind of globalist system, again, where powerful international banks and the institutions that protect them have more power than nations. And when you look at the recent speeches this administration has given at Davos and at Munich, they are reestablishing the principle of national sovereignty for everybody, not just for the United States.
Yeah, we will come later back to the first term of Donald J. Trump. You were analyzing that that was made de-industrialization of United States, and it was made on purpose. Can you explain us why you think it's on purpose and how they done it?
Well, again, let's go back through American history. Why did we declare our independence? Yes, it was principles of freedom and basic human dignity, but fundamentally it was an economic question. What is the nature of empire? The nature of empire is it wants to keep nations backward so it can simply extract raw materials. And what was happening in the United States or in the colonies is the British Empire would not let us manufacture anything, sent the raw materials over to Britain, sent them back to the United States at exorbitant prices, and we were supposed to keep backward. We established a different kind of system where we fostered real, genuine economic growth, industrial development, modern technology, and so on. And that, if you have a nation that is flourishing in industry, science, and technology, where your population is productive, it's happy because it is producing, it has a better life, then it's very, very hard to control you. So knocking the legs out of any nation's economic independence is a fundamental goal of this imperial system. And here in the United States, the group called the Council on Foreign Relations, which was really founded directly by the British Empire back in 1922 as an outgrowth of the British Round Table and the Royal Institute of International Affairs. Their little sister in the United States was the Council on Foreign Relations. So if you want to know what British imperial interests are or intentions, it's always useful to keep your eye on institutions like that. They said in 1977 that in order to break the economic independence of the United States and other nations for that matter, quote, controlled disintegration of the U.S. economy, of the world economy, is a legitimate objective. In other words, they were prepared to shatter economic health in countries in order to reestablish their globalist agenda, again, where you have private financial forces sitting on top of the whole world and other economic forces, subjugating nations to their continued imperial agenda. So, and that deindustrialization, I lived through it. I mean, that's essentially my lifespan. You know, from seeing, I'm in Detroit, Michigan, seeing a proud working and middle class city where in 1960 we had the highest per capita standard of living in the country because blue collar workers had decent wages and stable incomes. We went from that to being a hollowed out shell where the income of families in Detroit has been cut in half in the last 30 years. That's the result of deindustrialization.
That means that's how they transfer technology and also working forces from East, exactly from United States to the, for example, China. And that's how China was built.
Yeah. I mean, China was essentially a project of the globalists. That's not to say the Chinese Communist Party is not an institution in and of itself, that it has its own, although I think it's factionalized, it has its own interests and so on. But the game has always been build something up which can be used to undercut Western industrial powers, especially the United States. I think we all know Henry Kissinger played a key role in opening up U.S. relations with China. And again, some of these people really make no bones about who they're loyal to. Kissinger gave a speech in 1982 to this same Royal Institute of International Affairs that I mentioned earlier, where he said, when I was Secretary of State, I kept the British Foreign Office more closely informed than I did the President of the United States. So the U.S. policy toward China was not in the interests of the United States or its people. Policy toward China was ultimately in the interests of the globalists.
We can say also that Klaus Schwab, who established the World Economic Forum, was also pupil of Mr. Kissinger. And I know and I saw that Mr. Schwab has a big, we can say, admiring about China. And he see that China model is the best one. I saw and I read his book, Stakeholder Capitalism, where he explained everything in details. And also I had one show according to this topic.
Yeah. And it's interesting, if you look at when the World Economic Forum was founded, it was founded in 1972, shortly after the United States ended the Bretton Woods system, took the dollar off the gold reserve standard, because the World Economic Forum was essentially created to manage this transition into a globalist world without sovereign nations. And as you say, Kissinger played a role in that as well.
I just had one show with Mr. Mark Morano, and he was there. He was in Davos. And I asked him what was the main topic, and he said that Trump stole the whole event. Can you tell us now what has changed after Donald J. Trump came into power? What happened with Davos and with all these international organizations?
Well, I think especially in this second term, where he actually has a cabinet that is on his same wavelength and is acting, with one voice, they have made very clear, the Commerce Secretary said it at Davos, globalization is a failure. And the World Economic Forum was created to enforce and propagate globalization. So their trip to Davos was very, very clear. We are no longer playing by those globalist rules. But I think the other very important thing that happened at Davos, and this is what I believe is important, for a lot of your viewers, is the speech that was given by the trade ambassador, Jameson Greer. Because what he had a speech which was entitled The Hamiltonian Economics, which too many have forgotten. And I think this is really fundamental, because the problem that many people have in trying to understand the world is they've been fed two false choices in terms of what you must choose between. On the one hand, you either have big government or socialism and communism. On the other hand, you have free market, free trade, anything goes kind of capitalism. Now, let's say you're a 19-year-old or a 20-year-old in the United States or maybe anywhere else. You you have lived through the consequences of the failure of free trade capitalism with the 2008 collapse and everything that came before, deindustrialization, and has come after. So you say, oh, well, I don't like that. It's a failure. It is. I guess I'm a socialist. And you can see the same thing on the other side. What's missing, and this is where the trade ambassador's speech is so important, is that what has been written out of history for the past 100 years is the American system of political economy, which is neither communist nor free market capitalist. It says you don't measure your economic activity from the standpoint of who controls the money, how much money you can collect, and so on. That's what free trade does. I'll make a better profit, and then we're going to leave our working class in the dust. The American system says, no, economics is about physical economic production. Are we producing what we need as a nation more efficiently, with better technologies, with higher standards of living, and so on? That is the American system. And the British imperial system has hated the American system since its inception under the Washington administration. They've killed the presidents, pushed it, like Abraham Lincoln and William McKinley. And now, for the first time in more than 100 years, you have an administration which is explicitly reviving the American system, which is actually your only defense against globalization, against this kind of rapacious free market capitalism. And that's why I think the ambassador's speech at Davos was one of the most important speeches in decades. And I encourage people to read it because it will be a revelation. Again, there is something other than these two failed systems that we've been told we have to choose between.
And what was the goal of these tariffs from Donald Trump? He unfortunately now lost in Supreme Court, and what he gonna do next? Because he wants to transfer this technology back to the United States again, and these tariffs were a very powerful tool for that.
Well, first, he immediately moved to other laws that he could use. The reason he used the ones which the Supreme Court struck down is it gave him the most flexibility, but he essentially still has exactly the same powers, just a little more complicated. And both he and the Treasury Secretary have said that all of the countries that they're negotiating with or have negotiated with, no, nothing is going to change in terms of that. Tariffs are a seminal part of the American system. It says we want to be sovereign in terms of our manufacturing. We can't afford to be reliant on other countries for vital products, whether it's food, whether today it's chips, and whether it's medicine. We saw that certainly during COVID, where basic things like antibiotics, we were vulnerable to. These are all characteristics of a colony. And the whole point of tariffs is, no, you're not a colony, you're a sovereign nation. You determine what you need to produce in your own country. Classic example of this was strategic minerals and rare earths processing, where we have been totally dependent on Taiwan and other countries in terms of chips and in terms of rare earths and other materials. And Vice President J.D. Vance explained it very, very clearly. He said, look, a company would spend the money to get approval, find the site, start building, to do some kind of minerals processing, and then China would come in and undercut them. They'd lose all the money. And so nothing was being built in the United States, which is a vulnerability for any nation. So this administration just announced what they call Project Vault, where they are going to use the Export-Import Bank to make sure the financing is there and it's stable for companies to begin to build these vital facilities in the United States. They are creating like a bank for strategic raw materials where they will be there, they will be processed. Companies can, contract for them at stable prices and so on. So you're using the power of government. This is not the free market. You are using the power of government to say there are things that you have to have as a nation if you're going to be sovereign, stable, and prosperous. And we will partner with private industry to make sure that you have those things.
I saw one analysis who says that United States are powerful because they have perfect geography as a nation. And you can produce whatever you want and you cannot depend on anybody, especially after also you are now independent with oil production. And you now left the Paris Agreement. That means you will continue to use these cheap energy sources.
Yeah. I mean, you think about it. If you have the raw materials, if you have the population, if you have the water, the electricity, all of these kinds of things, why would you give it up? Which we did, which Europe has done, and by and large hasn't reversed itself, because once the European nations joined the European Union, they essentially gave up their sovereignty. But, if you sort of take a step back and you say, why would a nation strip itself of its ability to be economically independent? There is no normal answer to that, except somebody did it to you. And as we discussed earlier, the Council on Foreign Relations said it directly. The controlled disintegration of the world economy is our objective. They did it. No president really fought it for decades and decades. It didn't matter whether it was a Republican or a Democrat until now.
Let's go step by step, analyzing first year of second term of Trump. Can you say us what is your analysis, what he done, what he promised, and what else is in front of him?
Well, I think the main a lot of people in the United States, including in the Trump base, they get very disoriented saying, well, I voted because I wanted to see people arrested, or I voted for this, or I voted for that. I voted for an economic revolution. I voted for a return to the American system. And that means to make us a manufacturing superpower again, and bring back a middle class and a working class which had disappeared under globalization. You had the super rich, and you had basically the poor. So what has this administration done? It is totally focused on bringing industry and good-paying blue-collar jobs back. So when the president negotiates his trade deals, as people see, a hallmark of all of those is convincing other countries to invest in the United States. $18 trillion has been committed. Obviously, it's not all coming in at once, but there are enormous investments in new factories, which are already taking place in the United States. There are hundreds and hundreds of new factories being built in the United States. Facilities are being reopened. One marker of this was announced, I believe, last month. For the first time in 27 years, the United States is producing more steel than Japan. So you could already see the effect of it in terms of that particular sector, where in many cases it was just a question of turning on plants that had been turned off. Similarly with auto production. There's dislocations there because they're moving away from EVs and back toward traditional cars, so it's not quite as clear in the auto industry. But if the White House actually has a section called whitehouse.gov/investments, and they just list, and it goes on and on and on, the kind of investments coming into the United States. There were 70,000 new construction jobs created last year, because the first layer of this is to actually build the plants. And I think we'll start to see the impact of those plants opening over the course of 2026 with a vastly increased number of people who are working in manufacturing. And I always come back to this fact. Those are the kind of jobs where one income could raise a family. The hallmark of a stable society is where one income can comfortably support a growing family. We had lost that. Today, you got cobbled together 2 or 3 gig jobs per parent. Neither one is home. So the kids are left on their own, or you have couples that are working so hard they can't even see a way to have the time to raise or the money to raise children. This has been an anti-family, anti-human economic policy. And this administration is completely committed to reversing that. And Secretary Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, I thought put it very well at one point. He said, look, the Democratic Party's strategy is to compensate the loser. In other words, you lose your good paying job, you can't really take care of your family, or you're working 4 jobs. So we're going to throw a little bit of extra money at you so that you might barely be able to survive. But you're basically, at our mercy. And what the Treasury Secretary said is, I don't think these people are losers. I think it's the system that doesn't work, and we are changing the system. And again, to put it in its brand name, which most people are not familiar with, this is a return to the American system away from the British system.
What about financial system, what you have right now? You have a huge deficit and also huge debt. It's, I think, $39 trillion. Is there any plan to change this?
Well, I think there's 2 sides to it. The one is what this administration is very clear on, which is we have to grow our way out of the deficit. Now, obviously, tariffs are a major aspect of this, and will continue to be a major aspect of this. But rebuilding an actual productive base in the United States, where you have more businesses flourishing in the United States who will be, feeding into our tax base, where less people are on government assistance and are out working in productive jobs, and so on. So there's that aspect of and the administration has been clear, growing your way out, as opposed to, I might add, the old Wall Street Republican way of approaching this, which is cut everything, cut Social Security, cut Medicare. We've got to close the deficit, so we're going to cut everything. This administration is clear. We will cut the waste and the fraud, but we will not touch Social Security, Medicare, or Medicaid. And the president said that in the State of the Union message. That's one side of it. In a sense, that's the long-term antidote to how we got here. There is a financial bubble. There is no question that there is a huge amount of speculative paper, which really represents nothing real. And if you look at the way Alexander Hamilton dealt with this over 200 years ago, the infant republic was in debt. There were some who said, well, just repudiate the debt because it wasn't contracted by the American government. It was the Revolutionary War period and so on. And Hamilton said, no, you can't do that. No one will take us seriously as a nation. But he also knew that you couldn't pay the debt at that moment. What did he do? It was brilliant. And I'm waiting for the administration to come up with some version of this. He established a national bank. And he said to the people who hold the debt, well, we can't pay you right now. If you want to get paid, maybe I'll give you, $1 on, 100. But if you take that debt and you reinvest it in our bank, in 10 years, we'll be able to pay you back, which is what happened. So that debt was used, it was converted to capitalize the bank. Bank was used to build infrastructure, support manufacturing, build up the United States, and we grew our way out of the debt. Now, admittedly, the debt which is out there contracted by these speculative institutions, the derivatives on the derivatives on the derivatives on the derivatives, a lot of this is illegitimate. I think at some point it's going to be necessary to do a bit of surgery in terms of what is legitimate debt and not legitimate debt. But the one thing I think I can say is if you look at the statements, official statements by the Treasury Secretary and the proposed new chairman of the Federal Reserve, they are not interested in perpetually bailing out this bad debt forever. So I think we have a change in direction as far as that goes.
What will be the role of stablecoin in this restructuring of financing?
I always get very tentative when I stray into this area since it's not my strength and my wheelhouse. But I think what the administration is trying to do is recognize that we are in the 21st century, that we do have other instruments which did not exist in the 20th or the 19th or the 18th century. And I think the principle that they're always operating off of is to ensure that there is something which is not a Wild West under the control of international forces or supranational forces, that there is some kind of financial instrument which has got the government ensuring that it is stable and that it is something that is not going to be used by the speculators. So I think, when you look at somebody like Scott Bessent, who has worked on the other side, we all know he worked for George Soros at one point. He knows how this system works. And I think it is a challenge, and I certainly am not anywhere near having the background or the expertise to deal with this in any kind of detail. But how do you take a Hamiltonian system where you say that the purpose of your financial system is to support your productive economy? How do you take that principle and apply it in the 21st century where you have these enormous complexities of new kinds of financial instruments and so on? I'm confident that we have the people in this administration who are thinking about that question. How do you transit from a speculator-run system to a system which supports the producers in the 21st century environment? So I think they understand the principle, the mechanisms, and the means. I'm going to leave to them.
People are afraid that these digital currencies are a tool for control that will be to control transactions and people.
Well, that's certainly what the globalists want. The Canadian Prime Minister, Mark Carney, who has the dubious distinction of having been the head of two central banks, the Bank of Canada and then the mothership, the Bank of England, he was one of the first people to push this central bank-run digital currency, and it would do exactly that. It would be complete, total control by a global financier elite. And putting absolutely everybody at their mercy. This administration has been clear. They do not support a central bank-run digital currency.
Well, there is a very important topic also is coming, it's present here, is artificial intelligence. And I was listening to this globalist who said that artificial intelligence replace lots of jobs and finally people will stay out and they will organize for them universal basic income and that will be the future of our economy. What is your thoughts about this?
Well, look, artificial intelligence, I always remind people, a technology is in and of itself neither good nor bad. This is the debate about guns. It isn't the gun that kills people, it's the person who's using it. The same thing is true of artificial intelligence. First of all, I think it's an unfortunate name. There is no such thing as artificial intelligence. Machines will never replace human creativity. Machines are able to do complex computations. They're able to do amazing things. I'm sure all of us are now using it. I certainly use it. But one of the things that must be guarded against is this idea that it can somehow replace human creativity, because that creative spark in the individual human mind is what has advanced mankind over the millennia, and that is never going to be replaced by the zeros and ones of a digital system. That being said, it is a powerful tool, and it can either be used for good or it can be used for evil. Now, how is it going to affect? And the genie is out of the box. We're not going to put artificial intelligence back in the box. So it's clear countries are in an AI race. This administration is very clear on it as well. The biggest impact it's going to have immediately, and it is going to have an impact, is on white-collar jobs. The coders, the law firms that, had huge staffs to write briefs are like out of business literally overnight because of artificial intelligence. I think what it shows is a certain vulnerability of our society, which is that we had become much more of a consumer service sector society and had lost our productive capacity. So I think there will be some dislocations in the coming period, but I think it's going to move us back to a much more productive economy where, let's say, we have more engineers, mechanical engineers, transportation engineers, industrial engineers, as opposed to coders and people who write briefs in law firms. I have a sort of unique perspective on this question of new technologies. My grandfather was a Polish coal miner who moved here to Detroit over 100 years ago, and he went to work for Henry Ford at the original facility in Detroit in 1905. There was no assembly line. You just sort of put the car together from different tables and so on. There were a couple of hundred people working there. And then Henry Ford invented the assembly line. And people said, oh my gosh, it's going to put everybody out of work. No, because by 1950, you had the River Rouge plant, which employed 100,000 workers in one plant. So it went from a couple of hundred workers to 100,000 workers. Why? Because by improving the technology, more people could afford the product, and it grew the demand for it, and it transformed your society. Properly used, and I stress properly used, AI can be used to make a similar kind of transformation of our country. Now, clearly, the globalists have a different idea. And again, it all comes back to who is using it. It's not the technology itself.
Okay, then we need to go back here. What is more important for my viewers, because mostly of them are coming from Europe. Now, this new policy, America First, obviously, we cannot rely anymore on protection shield from United States as before. What do you think it will change in Europe according to this new policy of Trump?
Well, I think if you look at Secretary Rubio's speech to the Munich conference, when he said, we treasure the values of Western civilization. We cannot lose those values. And of course, under the EU, under current British policy, for example, those values are being trashed. With the unfettered immigration in these countries, with the green policies, which are destroying the industrial capacity of nations. I believe it was the Belgian prime minister right before the Munich conference gave a speech to a European Industrial Association, and he said these green policies are going to make us extinct, and these are deliberate policies. So the average citizen of a European country is not benefiting by the globalist policies which the Trump administration has rejected. So I believe, many people pointed out that Rubio's speech had a different tone than Vance's speech the year earlier, where Vance was very much in the Europeans' face in terms of the green policies and the censorship policies, and that Rubio's policy was not quite as in your face, although I think he actually said the same things. I think what he was doing was actually addressing the European people, not leaders like Starmer or Merz or Macron, the hardcore globalists who will fight wars forever with somebody else's children and destroy your economy with immigration and green policies. I mean, obviously there are different leaders in Europe, like Viktor Orban, like Giorgia Meloni, and a few others. But I think what the Secretary of State was doing was addressing European people, saying, there is a better way to run your countries. It's what we're doing. It's what a few of these other European countries are doing. You can restore your economies and your cultures, and we will back you if you want to do that. But we are no longer going to back NATO's perpetual wars, which obviously we see continuing in terms of Ukraine-Russia.
Yeah, we'll come a little bit back to Ukraine and Russia war, but just one more important thing. I think it's the most important thing because I'm a journalist here. You said that censorship policy is bad in Europe, and I know that First Amendment is the United States is the most important amendment. And I see that alternative media brought Donald Trump into power, not legacy media, but we have different approach in Europe. What are your thoughts about this?
Well, again, unfortunately, I see the European Union as, the most advanced form of this kind of globalist dictatorship, whether it's financial or whether it's in terms of censorship. We're seeing where the United States would have ended up had Donald Trump not been returned to office in 2024, because we were going in that direction ourselves here in the United States. perhaps one of the most important things which made the difference in terms of the United States liberating itself from the globalists was Elon Musk buying X, so that we actually did have an outlet where people could hear the alternative. And, it's obvious the people who want the world under a global dictatorship, they cannot tolerate free speech. So, you're seeing in Europe the most advanced form of that kind of clampdown.
We need to mention Russia-Ukraine war and what is the approach of Mr. Trump to this war. And do you think that you will continue to support Europe in this, or will need to manage this problem by ourselves?
Well, the president has been very clear. The war should have never happened. He doesn't get into detail on that, although a couple of times he has alluded to the fact that, when the Soviet Union collapsed, the West, Secretary of State Baker here in the United States and others said to Russia, all right, if you allow for the peaceful breakup, of this and allow these countries to become free, we will not expand NATO, which is the red line for the Russians. And of course, as President Putin and others have said, we have, the West has constantly broken that, expanded, added more nations to NATO. And the red line, of course, was Ukraine. And when the Russians, well, first, of course, you had the U.S. European-backed coup in Ukraine in 2014, where the legitimate government was overthrown with the backing, because that legitimate government was not ready to jump in bed with policies of joining NATO and full-fledged integration into the European Union, which really isn't that good of a deal if you look at what's happened to the European Union economies. So, the globalists kept pushing their Ukraine card. And obviously, at a certain point, the Russians said, no, you've crossed our red line. I think the president understands that very, very clearly. I think he knows, as I'm sure many of your viewers do, this could have been settled in 2022, except for Boris Johnson flying to Ukraine and saying, no, do not accept the Minsk agreements. So, the president has inherited a horrible situation. Every time he opens his mouth, he talks about, we have to stop the killing. So there is no question in my mind that he wants this settled. In recent weeks, he's been very clear. The problem is Zelensky, not wanting to negotiate, a final kind of settlement. Obviously, Zelensky is still being egged on and backed by the Europeans. Now you have this insane proposal being floated that the United Kingdom and France will give nuclear weapons to Ukraine. I mean, you might as well have World War III, on the agenda if you want that. I think the president is committed to stopping that, and is doing everything in his power to bring a peaceful agreement. But the United States is not going to support does not support the continuation of this war at this time. It certainly will not support any further continuation or escalation of this war.
And for the end, I have one personal question from my side, because I'm trying to find the answer, but I would like to hear your explanation. Why media, legacy media, and people in this media and lots of politicians hate Donald J. Trump?
Look, most of the legacy media, certainly in the United States and in much of the rest of the world, is just an arm of this entire globalist apparatus, which has been constructed over the past 100 years or so to propagate the various narratives which the empire needs to continue to control. And nobody has really challenged it. I mean, some lower level politicians to some degree here and there. But when you finally have someone who has the power of the presidency, as Donald Trump achieved in 2016 with his first election, whose policies are the polar opposite of the globalists, they see this, like two animals that have, instinctual hatred of each other. They have to destroy him. They cannot allow the United States of America to resume its role as a sovereign nation and a protector of other sovereign nations. When you have somebody who is using the power of the presidency to do that, they must be destroyed. And that's the mission of this legacy media.
Just one more message for the end. What you can say for Croatians first, Croatian people, we are member of European Union, and for other Europeans, what would be your message?
Well, first, let me say I traveled through Croatia back when it was part of Yugoslavia way back in 1970. Beautiful, beautiful country. Would love to return there again. I think for all people in Europe, it's necessary to just refresh your memory about the nature of empire and what are the principles of actual sovereign nations, and look for avenues through which you can begin to reassert your sovereignty. I think that is the critical question. And I hope and pray at some point the European Union becomes a thing of the past, and each nation can flourish in its own individual culture, uniqueness, and the contributions that every nation has made to Western civilization.
Just to say to our viewers where they can follow you, your work.
We have a website called PrometheanAction.com, and that hosts all of our video briefings, of which we do many a week, classes, articles, and so on. We have a free newsletter. People can sign up for that.
Mrs. Kokinda, thank you very much for your time, for your expertise. And I will follow you, of course, because your analyses are very interesting for me and to understand better what is policy of President Trump.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
Evo, dragi narode, imali ste prilike čuti sada jedan kut koji možda do sada niste mogli vidjeti. Sigurno niste mogli vidjeti u našim medijima. Naime, ono što sam spomenuo i tokom ovog intervjua, jasno je kad se govori o predsjedniku Trumpu da tu nema mjesta za racionalne analize, nego isključivo navijačke. Koga mrzi, sve što god radi smatra da je negativno, koga obožava je potpuno nekritičan prema svakom njegovom potezu. Kao što ste mogli primijetiti do sada, evo ja ponavljam, ja nikad neću ići na prvu loptu, nikad neću analizirati dublje, da donosim zaključke, već ću promatrati i prikupljati informacije. Niti jedan politički potez ne donosi rezultat na kratke staze. Možda prvu reakciju ili prvi dojam, ali rezultat dolazi nakon određenog vremena. I ono što danas imamo, to je rezultat politika prije godinu ili 2 dana. Prema tome, tako će biti i u budućnosti. Stoga neću ocjenjivati političke odluke, ali ih hoću analizirati i prolaziti kroz potencijalne buduće outcome, ili kako se kaže, rezultate toga. Tako isto ovog trenutka, baš danas, je počeo taj veliki sukob, odnosno rat u Iranu, i što će se dogoditi do emitiranja ove emisije ne mogu predvidjeti, niti želim predvidjeti, želim prikupiti informacije i ne reagirati, stoga zato sam danas i manji dio vremena proveo oko te teme, iako je vruća i aktualna, ali vam ne mogu dati svoje pretpostavke i analize. Ako hoćete slušati što čovječa mašta može proizvesti, onda slušajte ove naše stručnjake u mainstream medijima koji će vam odmah iz prve ruke reći što je Trump mislio time, što su Izraelci mislili time, što će Iran napraviti. Dakle, oni sve znaju. Jedno što na kraju kad napravite retrospektivnu analizu vidite da ništa nisu pogodili. Ja se neću upuštati u takve špekulacije, već ću istraživati, pozivati goste koji se tim bave detaljno da vam ponude alternativno ili objašnjenje ili informaciju, pa vi sami zaključite što možete iz toga. Ja vam sigurno neću nametati svoje mišljenje. Nadam se da ste zadovoljni današnjom temom i gospođom Kokindom i uskoro se vidimo u sljedećoj epizodi Slobodni.
Nitko vas neće natjerati da se poklonite zvijeri, učinit ćete to svoje voljno, odbacujući vjeru. Bićete laka meta za zvijeri, jer se niste podredili vjeri. Ako se ne podredite vjeri, podredit ćete se zvijeri. Toliko ćete se suobličiti sa ovim svijetom da nećete ni prepoznati da ste u zabludi. Biće to najveća demonska prevara ikada i pravedno zaslužena osuda nad nepokajanim grešnicima.
Gdje su svi oni koji su nas